The possibility of history providing cultural therapy for development has been remarked upon by Joseph Kizerbo, an African historian from Burkina Faso, who is one of the editors of the UNESCO General History of Africa. In an unpublished 1982 interview, he said, quote, "History can play the same role as the psychoanalyst. As long as we don't know how to explain certain events, certain behavior which exists today in the individual and collective planes, we will remain prisoners of our past because we don't understand it. But if one doesn't understand his history, even his own private history, he can cultivate complexes, believing, for example, that one is damned. History allows us to understand who we are. If one doesn't know who one is, one can't know what one wants or what one will become. I think that the almost exclusive role of history is to lay down this fundamental base of development. Very often today, Africans center around the means of development without asking two basic questions. Where are we going? And what do we have to do to get there? As long as these questions are unanswered and we rush into development, we're bound to fail." Unquote. Following the line of thought expressed above by Kizerbo, I have come to believe that our past, by the tasks it implicitly sets for us, is a compass to our future. That a map of our past is the pathfinder to our destiny. Thus, if we misread the map of our past or consult an incorrect map, we will misdirect our efforts in shaping our future. Taken from Decolonizing the African Mind, written by Baba Chinweizu. Decolonizing the African Mind is one of my favorite books. As said, written by Baba Chinweizu, probably most famous for his book, The West and the Rest of Us. But I first read Decolonizing the African Mind as a teenager. I think I was in college. So I'd have been about 16, 17 years old. And I've read it a number of times since. He goes into a number of different issues that are relevant to African people in many areas of people activity, be they the cultural, so things like the Olympics, the World Cup, Nobel Prize for Literature, and their relevance to us. Looking at various different political issues, economic issues, and social issues, and how we basically go through the process of decolonizing our mental in relation to these various things. And so, when at that age, it was one of the books that solidified my ideological foundation at that time. You know what I'm saying? So this is why I've gone back to it and consulted it every now and then since. But growing up in the Pan-African conscious community, the study of history was always quite explicit and open and encouraged. And so because of that, we come across various definitions of history, probably the most popular being that of Baba John Henrik Clarke, which begins, "History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a map that people use to find themselves it is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography." And it goes on. But obviously, this particular definition that had just been presented by Baba Chinweizu and Baba Joseph Kizerbo kind of plays on that theme as well. Another definition is from Robin Walker, author of When We Rule, and he says that history is all knowledge not acquired in the present. All knowledge not acquired in the present. A very all-encompassing definition of history. But what stands out to me about this particular definition in the book Decolonizing the African Mind is that it is entitled History as Therapy. History as therapy. And this idea of therapy is popularized at the moment. You know what I'm saying? We're having more conversations as a community globally, in fact, about the need for us to have therapy, because apparently Black people don't go to therapy. We don't really seek help for the things that we are experiencing on the emotional and psychological level. But in considering this in relation to this definition of history, I was, I kind of just was inspired to go check out some definitions of therapy. Yeah. And these definitions basically revolve around, if you get like rote definitions in terms of the dictionary, you will see things like treatment for an illness or disorder, I'm saying particularly in the spheres of mental, emotional, and behavioral health. If you go to the more in-depth definitions which are given in the field, of psychology, they will add words in like developing positive thinking and coping mechanisms. I'm saying, so this is the purpose, to develop a positive sense of self, and methods for coping with the stresses of life, in ways basically that don't manifest in disorders or in behavior whereby you do harm to self and others. And so once looking at those definitions, I was basically putting it back in the context of history and identifying the fact that therapy is, by definition, a historical discipline. It is a discipline that is historical in its nature. It relies upon history. When you go to see a therapist, you are giving, presenting your idea of yourself as accumulated through your life experience, which is your history. You are giving them an idea of who it is you think you are, who it is you think you are not, based upon your understanding of your history. And even if you've gone to therapy not quite having a conscious idea of who or what you are, whatever it is you say is going to give the therapist, who is trained to pick up certain signs, certain language, certain behavior patterns, and understand them. You are giving them an idea of who you are based upon that history. So really, the therapist is able to help you because they are able to understand and interpret the signs of your historical experience, and helping you is going to be the process by which they get you to understand, process, and be able to make your historical experience functional in your life. So this is a historical discipline. It's based upon history, explicitly and implicitly. But we tend to reduce therapy to the individual level. So therapy now, even when we're discussing therapy as a people, Black people don't go therapy. We're talking about our individual experiences. And the understanding of the fact that history is never just individual, because all of our histories are the composite kind of experience of our interaction with other people, and shared experiences with other people. So families have histories, peoples have histories, and those histories affect the individual on us on the individual level. In many senses, the individual history is the product of the collective history, and therefore the individual impacts the collective history based upon their individual contribution to that collective history. So in a sense, the more fundamental experience of history is that of the collective. I am because we are. And so in effect, if we're only dealing with the history of individuals divorced from a collective experience, we're not really going through a comprehensive therapeutic process. We're not really going through a comprehensive therapeutic process. All right, so I'm concerned about this collective idea of history as therapy, and then looking into the work of Joseph Kizerbo, because I've haven't really done much research into him himself. He was just this name that Baba Chinweizu had quoted for quite some time. So recently I decided to do that. Check out what the elder, the kind of things that the elder has done. And one of the things I came across is actually this UNESCO African history document that he was partly responsible for developing. And one of the things that he does is he goes into the function of oral history in African societies, yeah, and the role that it plays. All right, very important. There's a big debate about the reliability of oral histories on the continent, yeah, and I think more and more historians are starting to see their value, but traditionally in Eurocentric historical discipline, as far as coming out of the academy is concerned, the idea, and this was put to me at Speaker's Corner the other day actually, the idea is that history began with the written word. Yeah, so only when people began to start writing things down did history, yeah, as a discipline begin, which is a totally flawed and erroneous viewpoint, but it's Eurocentric. So they're allowed to have their own definition as it applies to them. The only problem is when they use their definition and try to apply it to the rest of the world. This guy said this to me at Speaker's Corner and got very offended when I ventured to suggest that his definition of history comes from a Eurocentric misunderstanding of the discipline, yeah? Because when we look at the traditions of Jali or griot in African societies, and I'm using those two words which are West African, but the function actually replicates itself all over the continent. This idea that there are individuals or groups of people within a nation that are responsible for memorizing the narrative of the journey of the people, and being able to recall that narrative at certain points in the people's present sojourn to provide understanding, context, and even suggestions for how to move forward. Yeah, this role needs to be properly understood in the sense of the fact that the narrative of a people. I was reading as you know, I was reading Eloquence of the Scribes, yeah, and by Ayekweama. In the book, he talks about Abakasem and Anansisem. Yeah, Abakasem is like the ancestral oral history of the people. Yeah, the oral history that relates to the ancestors. Yeah, and the journeys of the people. Okay, and Anansisem is the more allegorical, mythological, the mythology of the people. So this is where you get, and you notice the word Anansi, yeah, the spider in that. Anansisem is the more cosmological, yeah. So the principles, the values, the cosmology of the people is carried in Anansisem, and both of these two storytelling disciplines have a functional role within the society in terms of reinforcing the principles and values of the society, but also reinforcing the history of the people. Yeah, so many of the songs would tell stories of the journeys of the people having come from somewhere else to where they are presently today, what they faced on those journeys. Yeah, how they overcome the challenges on those journeys, yeah, and all of this comes together to make the history of the people a living reality among the people. So history is not a distant kind of thing, detached, with dates and events in the past over there. No, history is lived. It is experienced through the rituals of the people, through the stories that the people tell, and those ideas, the people's sense of self and their understanding of themselves is constantly reinforced through these stories that are told, these songs that are sung at important communal events, even things like funerals, marriage ceremonies, and different cultural imperatives of a people throughout their sojourn. Yeah, and so basically the point I'm making here is that oral history in an African society is functional. Yeah, it is how the people understand themselves. It is consciously reinforced. And so when people are constantly living out their understanding of themselves and correcting, some of whatever they have carried with them as a result of whatever traumas they have experienced over time. Yeah. So this is very important. And in this day and age, we have this detached idea of history whereby now it is not uncommon for us to talk down about a focus on history. The Pan-African community, the conscious community, is often regarded as living in the past because of its focus on history. Yeah, we get this idea of living in the past as though the focus on the learning about, the teaching about history is keeping us locked in this thing that we call the past. Yeah, when in actual fact, as Baba Joseph Kizerbo has said in this particular quote, it is the lack of understanding of history that keeps us locked in the past, keeps us locked in a loop, not being able to move forward because we lack a proper understanding of history. You know what I mean? We have to rewire our appreciation of these things. It's actually a lack of understanding of history, a lack of appreciation of history, a lack of immersion in the history of your people that keeps you trapped. Yeah, an understanding of history is actually what unlocks you from perpetuating, just repeating, that history. And I was thinking about this in terms of the issue of depression. Yeah, depression is often linked to the inability to process or understand the particular aspect of something that has happened to you. Yeah, your inability to resolve a past issue. Yeah, can result in depression and all kinds of different mental disorders. And so again, going through therapy allows you to get a proper understanding of that history, reconcile, whatever it is that you have experienced, and therefore move forward. So on the collective plane, I'm there now thinking about some of these complexes that we might develop here as a result of a flawed understanding of our history. Yeah. And I was thinking about a few. One of which is the idea that Africans sold us into slavery. This is a popular idea. Yeah. Africans sold us into slavery. And what I was really contemplating was, what does this reading of our history, what impact does it have on our present idea of who and what we are and the things that we engage in? Yeah, the things that we do, the behavior patterns that we develop as a result of this understanding of history. So there's the one, African sold us into slavery. The other one that I was contemplating was this idea of tribalism, as the perpetual African existence, that the African people have always been organized into tribes that are constantly in conflict and warring with each other. And then this develops now into the idea that today the continent is 54 countries that are warring, always warring, or in conflict with each other. And these three ideas are linked, but the reinforcement of these ideas constantly in our experience again has a function. It is functional. It plays a role in terms of our sense of self and our behavior towards ourselves and each other in today's world. And so, looking at this in terms of a few present day examples, this relates to now what Baba Chinweizu was saying about misreading the map or consulting a wrong map. Misreading the map or consulting a wrong map. If we misread the map of our past or consult an incorrect map, we will misdirect our efforts in shaping our future. So having a wrong idea of our history makes it impossible for you to shape your future in a self-determined way. It means that somebody else is shaping your future for you, because a wrong map is usually a map that wasn't, drawn up by yourself. You know what I'm saying? Based upon the journey that you are trying to make. You know what I mean? So, Africans sold us into slavery. And what's interesting is that the reparations movement has done a lot of work in terms of debunking this particular idea, putting it into context, so as not to allow the West, Britain and America, Europe in general, to deflect, attention from the fact that they are responsible for what is regarded the greatest wrong ever done by one people to another people. Yeah, by this idea that slavery is principally the result of a collaboration, a conspiracy between European merchants, and African kings and chiefs, which is not the case, right? You know what I'm saying? But the reparations movement historically has done a lot of work in terms of developing a proper understanding of our history that will allow us as a people, as a diaspora, to collectively reconcile, this complex situation that took place, with regards to African history and how it affected traditional African pre-colonial societies, but this is all wiped away, washed away, with this idea that Africans sold Africans into slavery. And so today we have the ADOS movement, the African descendants of slavery, the African descendants of slaves, and this is a movement that has popularized the conversation of reparations on social media, I say popularized. It has been popular on social media before, but this is a particular kind of expression of it. All right. And much of the narrative, the ADOS narrative, in terms of slavery, validates the idea, and in many ways aggressively puts forward the idea that it was our brothers and sisters on the continent who sold us into slavery. The idea that there are African nations in West Africa and Central Africa that had economies based upon the selling of Africans, their brothers and sisters, into slavery. So the implications of this are manifold. It begins with us having a deficient idea of what African civilization was, the economies of African civilizations. It results in us detaching ourselves from our indigenous nations and our brothers and sisters who are the descendants of those indigenous nations who continue to reside on the African continent. But more insidious than that is that it places us in a position whereby reparations now must not only be sought from the European who is responsible for these crimes, but we make our ancestors and therefore our brothers and sisters on the continent co-conspirators, in this atrocity, which, has lasting implications for any liberation movement, or more specifically, has very specific implications for how we formulate a liberation movement in this day and age. Historically, the liberation movement has always tried to link the diaspora and has developed understandings of history, that put our history in context in order for us to unite with each other. But then when you have an understanding of history that necessarily disunites you, then are we effectively prolonging our oppression? Are we effectively leaving each other open to further intrigue, further destruction by those narratives of history? You understand what I'm saying? So this ADOS narrative is one that sees our brothers and sisters from the continent with suspicion, and antagonism. We don't relate very well because we have, first of all, this understanding of history that tells us that they sold us into slavery. So when we encounter them in the present, we relate to them as people that sold us into slavery. This is what this does. This is the implication of this thing. And unless we go through the process of, putting history in its context, that therapy, then we're going to continue to perpetuate harm towards each other. Then there's this issue of tribalism, and the idea that Africa has always been a continent full of tribes that are in constant competition and conflict, and this is a deep one, right? Because I find it interesting that even in relation to African source into slavery, we can use the word African to say African source into slavery, but the idea that we use African as a term of unity across the diaspora becomes problematic, yeah, for us. Yeah, so African is applicable to those people on the continent that saw us into slavery, but not all of us globally when we're trying to unify. Yeah, and this tribalism idea, a similar thing happens whereby if anybody ventures to suggest that Africa was once at any point, yeah, or should I say more specifically, African people, yeah, across or in significant proportions of the continent of Africa, yeah, were existed in a state of complementarity and unity, this idea can be rejected, yeah, off the cuff by people. Yeah, people have problems getting their head around that idea. And we'll war with you based upon no information, no study, yeah, or very little, yeah, study of the idea. And we'll war you for it, yeah, but find it very easy to accept, yeah, this idea that the first people on the planet, yeah, were always existing in a state of conflict and tribalism, yeah, very very destructive. And so there's no analysis, then therefore there's no understanding of how these things that we call tribes, yeah, and this word tribe is a word that is used to dehumanize African people and African civilization more specifically, yeah. But there's no understanding of how these various different groups of people, these various different nations of people come into existence, what their journeys are and were, yes, and whether they always existed in this particular state. No analysis of that. Yeah. And so because we don't have that history, we lack an understanding of ourselves. We think that we came from conflicting and warring tribes rather than, yeah, nations of people that were able to coexist. And this has a direct implication on how we see our capacity to unite in this day and age. Yeah. So it affects us in the sense of, well, do we even need to unite? Yeah. Is it even possible for us to do so? Because we were never united. This is the idea. And these are things that people are saying. And then now this relates to this idea of Pan-Africanism. And, this concept of the fact that today 54 states on the continent exist in perpetual conflict. Yeah. Which is an idea that does not take into consideration the history of how those 54 states come into existence. People are acting and speaking as though Africans created 54 countries on a continent for the purpose of protecting borders and economic interest. There are no borders, yeah, except for maybe one. There are no borders on the continent that were created for the economic benefits of African people. All of these borders, again, save for probably one, were created by Europeans in 1884 and 1885, who went to war with Africans in order to institute those borders. Yeah, and the maintenance of those borders in today's world only serves to continue that process of dividing up the richest landmass on the planet Earth, yeah, for the economic benefit of former colonizers, present neo-colonizers, yeah? And so the idea is that, well, if the Africans in Africa can't even unify, why should we try to be unifying as African people? Yeah? And so one, we don't even consider the history of how those states come into existence. But then we don't even consider how those among us have tried to overcome the trauma, the levels of oppression that have been able to be inflicted upon us as a result of the existence of these states. Yeah, I recall, for example, hearing Brother Luwezi from the Uhuru movement speak once. And he was speaking on the life and legacy of Patrice Lumumba. And he said that one of Patrice Lumumba's major skills is that he didn't deal with tribalism. And because of this, he was able to go among different groups in the Congo, what would be called or classed as tribes, yeah, and unite them as one people with a unified purpose, a unified mission at hand. This was one of his great assets, Patrice Lumumba. And we'll find this idea replicated all over the continent whereby people are fighting for liberation. Yeah. That different groups, what we would consider different tribes, are able to unite in the liberation fight. Yeah. Um there's a documentary on the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and that's one of the things that they give expression to there, in which they are explaining when Britain, America, Belgium, and France were collaborating to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. The stool pigeon puppets that they had in the Congo had Patrice Lumumba on the run. And so he was trying to get to a province, yeah, at which, you know, he had a significant level of support. He knew he would be safe there. But on the journey, he would stop and speak to people in every village, every city, every province that he entered. He would speak to them. And he was beginning to sway the tide against all of the negative propaganda that was out there about him and his party, that was beginning to have a negative impact upon the unity of Congo at the time. Yeah. And the documentary speaks to an individual who I'm forgetting at the moment, but basically saying that, you know, he was trying to basically reunify the people and get rid of, you know, the discord. And he had the ability to do it. Well, he said that in so many words. He had the ability to do it. He had the spirit, the character, yeah, to be able to bring the people together on a one accord. But because of this, because he had that ability and he was exercising it at the time, in terms of directly related to the people, it slowed down the journey, yeah, towards his safety. And so the forces that were coming against him were able to catch up with him, yeah, on this journey, and eventually assassinate him, yeah. But this is an example that speaks to unity, yeah. The work of Baba Kwesi Pra, yeah, in terms of looking into African languages and finding the roots of these various thousands of African languages that we're told that we have, yeah, demonstrates the fact, just by virtue of the cultural appreciation, that we are coming from larger people groups. In other words, we're one people, yeah. And so just that understanding of history changes the game, yeah. So we see how a different appreciation of our history has a direct impact upon the kind of movements, the kind of political movements that we develop in today's world. So, as a result of all this, I'm kind of just inspired to contribute to developing a functional, self-defined, and self-determined ideas, ideals, and understandings of our collective history, in the hope and in the knowledge that they will serve us towards our own self-defined and self-determined development once we have gone through that process. History is always a lived experience. The only question is whether we are conscious of the history we are living out or not. ShakaRa'flection, inspired by Decolonizing the African Mind, written by Baba Chinweizu, featuring a quote from Baba Joseph Kizerbo. Tenda Mwali.